So for those of you who don't know me, so my name's Sarah and I am the founder of Full Circle Funerals. So we would describe ourselves as modern funeral directors, and everything that we do is about supporting people to feel connected after bereavement. Everything, I guess part of what we do at Full Circle is to try to make conversations about death, dying and bereavement as accessible as possible. And increasingly, we facilitate quite a lot of learning events, for example, the conference that Ben mentioned. And we're increasingly asked if we have any advice to support people who are experiencing bereavement at work. For example, people who work in home care, in care homes, or even in more acute medical settings. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is just to share some of what people have told us. So it's really important, I guess, to caveat all of this with the fact that I am not a bereavement counsellor. I'm not specifically trained to deliver bereavement support, but this is a summary of reflections that people have shared and what we see as part of our work as funeral directors, what people tell us, because of course we work with many professionals when we're supporting families. So what I hope to do is share some principles and some headlines with you so that you can identify what might be helpful for you and what you might choose to pass on to other people. As I've said, I'm not really expecting to say anything that is a particular revelation to anybody, but more to bring things together in a way that hopefully is helpful and helps with some practical application. So we'll start by having a little look at the fundamentals of loss and bereavement, then make the distinction between vicarious trauma and bereavement at work, then consider a little bit about self-care after bereavement, how to stay connected, how to consider bereavement support, how we help each other, and then, like I say, hopefully a bit of space for discussion at the end. Now, my slideshow has set itself to, after a certain amount of time, to go on to the next slide, which is actually, as a presenter, like feeling a lot of pressure to time my words. So excuse me if I flit a little bit backwards and forwards. Obviously press some clever button that I don't actually know exists and I don't know how to undo. So grief is not something that at a societal level in the UK we talk about very much. Some cultures, as most of you in the group know, are more comfortable with others when it comes to expressing emotion. And when we're not comfortable doing that openly, then it can certainly contribute to grief being expressed mainly in private. I recently read a book called Atlas of the Heart by Brené Brown, which I would highly recommend if you haven't read it. And in her book, she shares that over the course of 5 years, she surveyed more than 7,000 people. And the average, well, in fact, let's have a quick guess if anyone's willing to shout out. What do you think the average number of emotions were that people were able to name? Anybody who's brave enough to turn your camera off and shout out a number. What do you think the average was?
10.
10. Okay, thanks, Molly. Okay, we'll go with 10 unless anybody has an advance on that. So it was actually 3. So the average person can name happy, sad, and angry. And her argument is that actually we've managed to reduce, she talks about 87 different emotions, we've managed to reduce those down to happy, sad, and angry. And of course, that's a very oversimplified way of understanding and describing our emotions to ourselves and others. Now, most people would associate grief with sadness. Would probably tick the sad box, maybe a little bit the angry, but mostly sad. But actually, as you can see from the slide, there are many, many more feelings that people would describe and experience after they have experienced a loss. And knowing that there are a greater number of feelings associated with healthy and everyday bereavement experience can be very reassuring for many people. So for example, if we had a bit more awareness that actually shock and numbness, denial, guilt, and relief are very normal and healthy emotions to have after bereavement. For many people, that would be very reassuring. We particularly see that some people may feel a great sense of relief, particularly if there has been a very long period of caring and uncertainty, and maybe quite challenging circumstances that have led up to somebody dying, actually there can be a sense of relief and then guilt associated with that feeling. So if we can normalise an understanding of that, that would be a very good start. Another really common way that people would describe feelings of grief is by feeling helpless and having a strong sense of yearning for the person who's died. So the other thing that I personally think we're not very good at talking about is the physical manifestations of grief. And bereavement can have a really profound effect on our bodies. Now, from what I've read, people have put it down to sort of one of two things really. One is stress, so an increase in stress hormones, which then have a physical impact and physical effect on how people's bodies behave and how they feel, or that it may be due to an increase in inflammation that happens naturally after such a significant event. But the range of physical symptoms that people can experience are huge. Headaches, joint pain, back pain, digestive problems. If anybody is interested in knowing more about the impact of bereavement on digestion, then there's a lady called Sabine Horner who has specialised in talking about this, and she has a blog on our website, and she also has a lot of her own resources which are very interesting to read. People can also experience chest pain, palpitations, feelings of shortness of breath, concentration can be really challenged, and for the majority of people they also have some disruption to their sleep. And it'd be really frightening to suddenly have physical symptoms after a bereavement if you don't know that that can be part of the experience. And it's really reassuring to know that actually these symptoms can be part and parcel of your physical and psychological reaction to grief. However, the ex-medic in me needs to stress another disclaimer, which is particularly for concerning symptoms like chest pain and shortness of breath. I would never be suggesting that people should be putting this down to grief alone. Clearly, there are some symptoms that do require some more investigation, but it's helpful. We certainly find when we're supporting families, being able to talk to them about the fact that they may have some physical manifestations of their grief can be really reassuring, particularly when it comes to concentration and their ability to complete tasks in the way that they used to. Okay, so vicarious trauma. Now that's a term that I think over the last few years we've been talking about a little bit more, and it may be a phrase that some of you know a little about or a lot about. And it comes up quite a lot within the bereavement and funeral care space. Because in particular for counsellors and bereavement specialists, it may be something that we need to be really very mindful of. I think it's quite helpful to make the distinction between vicarious trauma and bereavement at work. So vicarious trauma, I've just briefly summarised on the slide. So that's when people are experiencing through others their pain, suffering and need. And by being with that individual who has had that experience, you start to identify with them, and their challenging experience becomes part of your own experience. That's quite distinct from bereavement at work. And what we're talking about there is that when you're supporting somebody professionally, and I suppose the classic role to consider this in would be maybe if you're a carer in a care home or a home carer going into someone's home, that actually people form really close relationships. I suppose, you know, for the people in the room as well, you know, soul midwives, end of life doulas, people who are working closely with someone in a professional capacity where that person that they are supporting then dies. And that relationship can become really close. It might have a professional basis, but actually that can become a really deep and strong relationship and connection. And then a bereavement occurs when that important person dies. So bereavement at work, I guess, is distinct in that the bereavement occurs because when the relationship has been formed in your professional capacity. And I suppose what this is, what the basis of really what we're talking about here is recognizing that that is a really valid and legitimate bereavement. And that potentially in those situations, some people, some professionals, if it's not recognized and not validated, may end up feeling quite disenfranchised. And that actually that relationship between carers and the people they support can really be very powerful. It's important that we make that part of our conversation. Okay, so just, I guess this is just a slide, again, nothing new in here, but just a little bit of a refocus on considering the principles of well-being. There are more, but these are the ones that feel immediately applicable when we're considering well-being after bereavement, because a lot of how we can support ourselves, our teams, and each other is actually in reminding ourselves of these principles and paying attention to them and identifying what would work well in the given circumstance. So sleep hygiene. My husband's a psychiatrist actually, and he's written whole modules on sleep hygiene. So that's a whole subject in its own right. But just having routines and practices that promote sleep, particularly at times where it's challenging. Nutrition, I've mentioned, but recognizing that actually after bereavement, many people's digestion and hydration is challenged in terms of their body's ability to digest. And of course, their behaviors and their habits will change. So trying to eat small amounts regularly, staying hydrated, and eating the rainbow would be some simple principles, not perfect, but some simple principles to support ourselves and others. Hydration, really important, and introducing some gentle movement. And I think there's a prevailing narrative generally now, which seems to make a lot of sense, which is that it's about finding what feels good and suits the individual, not about everybody who doesn't want to suddenly engaging in high levels of aerobic exercise if that's not their thing. And again, if you're supporting a team or an individual, maybe about trying to identify actually what feels good for them and what works well, and then encouraging them to engage in that in a way that works. And then there's also many other things that people have told us that they have found helpful generally for well-being, but also after bereavement. So creating things, for example, mosaicing, needlework, drawing. Doesn't have to be a professional artist creating something professional. This is about people just sitting and mindfully using creativity as a way to be in the moment, and maybe also as an opportunity to express what you're feeling without needing to find the words, because sometimes words are just quite challenging. So finding a different way to express. It's also not necessarily about these creations being shared. It may be something that's very private, but a way to begin to understand, articulate, and express how you're feeling. Now, music is very powerful for many people. And music can be supportive in a number of different ways. So it may be that music is used to remember happy times. It might be that music is consistent with how you're feeling or how a team is feeling and actually helps as a way of releasing, understanding, and articulating. You know, I suppose when listening to a heartbreak song when you've been dumped brings back memories. It helps for me, it helps to articulate and connect with what you're feeling using someone else's words. And it might also be a really powerful way to connect to the person who's died, either because that was music that you shared, or maybe by creating a legacy song. So writing a piece of music with support or without, writing some words for a piece of music, and then that becoming an important part of your connection with that person. And then finally, again, something I think that we're generally talking about a little bit more is the idea of journaling or writing letters. So writing down thoughts, writing down feelings, and expressing things, not verbally but by putting that in a journal or a piece of paper. And then again, there's do with those, what people do with those, what they choose. It may be that that's kept somewhere safe. It may be that that's not kept at all. Some people maybe do some ritual burning of those letters, or it may be that they're put into a boat and sail off down the river. There's lots of different things that you might choose to do with those. Or for others, it might be that it's a letter to the person that's died, or a way of expressing themselves to people around them when they're struggling to do that verbally. And I think the key is if we talk more openly and we know about these tools and we can share that with people who may find them helpful, then people will identify with what works well for them. Okay, so I thought we would have a quick kind of 2 minutes, and I'm not expecting anybody to share, but I thought you're welcome to, but I thought it might just be helpful just to apply some of that. And what I would encourage you to do is just for 1 minute even, I shall time, have a think about what, from your perspective, what you know that helps you to stay well. So it may be one of the things that we've talked about, it may not, but what have you learned about yourself that helps you to support your well-being? And if you could put that into sort of top 3 priorities, then that would be wonderful. So I will literally give you a minute. And then if that's something you'd like to share when we come back to the discussion later, that would be great. If not, that is also fine. And I will do the same. I hope everyone at Full Circle is not cheating. I hope you're all doing it. I'll come and check your little bits of paper. Okay, that's probably about a minute. And it'd be interesting if you're happy to share later whether actually some of your 3 priorities were in that list, or whether actually there are some different things that I need to include next time as food for thought for others. Okay, so moving on from, I guess, well-being generally, and I just want to explore the concept of connection and staying connected. Now, after bereavement, there are a number of, in terms of promoting well-being, there's again a more and more conversation about the importance of human connection and connection generally in terms of our mental and physical well-being. So I thought it was helpful just to break down who that connection might be to. So after a bereavement, that connection might be to yourself. And on a really simple level, that would be about understanding how you're feeling, what you need, and therefore understanding what your priorities might be and what you might want to access to help yourself to stay as well as possible. The connection might be to friends and family. So it might be identifying particular individuals within your personal network that actually you are finding particularly nurturing at that time, or finding a connection to them seems to serve you well. It might be that the connection is to professionals, and that might be actually to some of you, so the people that are experiencing bereavement, you may be supporting them. And those professionals, so that might be bereavement specific professionals, that might be us as funeral directors, but it could also be a wider professional network. So that could be the GP, that could be other professionals within the community that there's already a connection to. The other important connection for many people is connection to religion and spirituality. And for everybody that looks very different, and culture we should include in there as well. For everybody that looks very different. For some people that might be really clear and really quite well identified and prescribed and an important part of their network. For others that might be more individual, but that connection can be increasingly important after a bereavement. Community is a really important connection for many people, and that community looks and feels different for all of us, and is a very broad term, I guess, to include the different communities that we engage in. For some of us that might be a business community network, it might be a group that we attend socially, it might be something associated with hobbies. There are many, it might be a geographic community, it might be the bereavement community. So there are many different communities, but it's worth again considering whether that is an important place for an individual. And then really importantly, and a key part of what we're keen to raise awareness about, is connection to the person who's died. And there are many ways and activities that can support a positive connection and a continued bond with somebody who's died. And that might be through certain places, dates, a recipe, songs, memory bears, memory jars. There are lots of different activities. And I think if we could take something away from today, I think it's really, my opinion is that it's really important that we increase awareness about the importance of these connections, because awareness is the first step. And if this is something that we think about and talk about with each other and with the people that we're supporting, then actually that then leads to people considering where they have strong connections, which connections serve us well, which connections are maybe less important, and maybe where something is lacking, and that then can result in some action to think about actually what might be helpful at any given time, and particularly after bereavement. So I've got another little minute of reflection, or maybe 2 minutes for this one. It'd be embarrassing if you knew how long it took me to create these coloured blobs. So we're just going to sit with them for a little while because they were surprisingly difficult. Jade's probably giggling. She generally helps me with all of these things, and she wasn't there, so I had to do it all by myself. So just considering, I guess, those 6 potential connections and places of connection, thought it would be helpful, again, just for a couple of minutes privately, for you just to consider which of those connections right now, or possibly reflecting on a time where you had experienced a bereavement, which of those connections was particularly important and resonates, which feel less important, and which might be areas that you think, okay, I haven't quite considered that, and that might be something for me to consider going forward. So again, just a few minutes. I'll give you 2 minutes because there are, I guess, 6 places to explore. Just to I'll go on mute and give you a few minutes just to consider those connections. Okay, it was about 2 minutes. So again, if you're happy to share some thoughts when the camera's off and also the recording's off at the end, that would be lovely to hear if anything interesting came up as a result of that. Okay, so moving on from connection to bereavement support, there are increasingly opportunities and resources available for people to access bereavement support, which is brilliant. Now, sometimes that's in a group, sometimes it's one-on-one, and sometimes it can be more anonymous. And I think from my perspective, I think what we could do collectively is the more that we talk about the different options that are available, the more likely somebody is to identify and find out what works for them. Some people don't want to meet in groups. It's not somewhere where they feel safe. It's not something that works for them. They want to engage much more anonymously. And whereas for others, that one-to-one interaction is really important. Similarly, there are now many options for people receiving either face-to-face support, online support, or by telephone. And I certainly know of a number of people that I've supported where actually realizing that bereavement support was available over the phone was quite a big game changer for them, because that was much more convenient. They could fit it in with everything else that they needed to juggle. And there was something kind of, it was almost a hybrid between it being slightly more anonymous and comfortable, but they were still receiving the one-to-one support. And then there are also a lot of additional resources now. There are a huge range of podcasts available, and they range from the quite serious or maybe quite sort of technical and theoretical to the much more humorous, and people talking about their lived experience, people really, that there's very different tones that the podcasts take. And again, that works differently for different people. Similarly with books, there are some books which really share information about grief and bereavement in quite an informative way. And then there are more and more books where people share their lived experience and how that felt for them. So for example, Rio Ferdinand's book, I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but for a certain demographic, actually being able to read some someone's experience, someone that you can identify with and feels like they really do, that is somebody that you understand and relate to, makes a really big difference. So again, social media, there are more and more people talking very openly and accessibly about grief and bereavement on social media. Now, timing is an important consideration. So there is a school of thought, or there was certainly a stronger school of thought, that actually all of this needed to kick in later. And if people accessed support too early, actually that kind of wasn't necessary, because it was more if people were still struggling later. I think that's been quite significantly challenged now by people saying, actually, if people feel that they need support early, then that's the time to access support, because that might be actually that intervention earlier and that support earlier might mean that the entire grief journey is feels much more positive and supported. So timing is a consideration. And I think the other important thing there is that the time during which people might need and benefit from support doesn't stop. It may be that it is years and years later when actually some of these resources, and we certainly find when we're out and about in community, sometimes people will approach us and they will, because we're funeral directors and we're therefore a safe person to speak to about these things, people will talk about bereavement that happened a long time ago. And at that point, when we share information about bereavement resources that are available, actually that's the time maybe that people are ready and able to connect, and also still need to. So I think the timeline is long. Some bereavement support resources are general bereavement support. Some are more specific to that individual circumstances, be that circumstances of their death or maybe their age. So for example, there's Widowed and Young, which supports people who've experienced bereavement after a partner's died. There are specific bereavement support charities and organisations that support children, or specifically siblings. There are resources to support people who've experienced bereavement after suicide, or maybe who've experienced a bereavement after a traumatic event like a road traffic accident. So there are specific places that deal with very specific circumstances. And as I feel like the drum, I'm sure the point I hope I've made, because I've said it enough times, is the importance is knowing what's available and that's sharing that, because then people will find what works for them. And the other thing to note is that what people need may well change. So for example, it's not uncommon for people to initially feel that they need one-to-one support, and then maybe over time actually they think, I'm maybe ready and it feels better for me now to move on to a peer support environment, because maybe what they think will benefit them and help them changes over time. Okay, now just something I was quite keen to, so I've delivered something similar to this a few times, and something that's come up and very validly, so I've included it here, is another important consideration is the other people who may be living in that service or that environment who are also who also have experienced a bereavement. So for example, in a residential or nursing care home, maybe the other service users or the other residents of that service, or in a hospital ward, the other people who are in that ward, or lots of, so not the professionals, but the other individuals who have experienced and have also experienced a loss. And I thought it'd be helpful just to share some thoughts about that. So I used to work in a residential care setting, so this is definitely something I feel quite familiar with. But I think one strong suggestion is that honesty is helpful. Be unlikely for users of a service to be completely unaware of the fact that someone that they lived with last week is no longer there. It's possible, but it's unlikely. Creating opportunities to remember may be powerful and helpful, and incorporating that in part of the support that people receive and deliver may be helpful. So this image here is from a care home, and they have pebbles. So people who are residents of the care home have the opportunity to create a memory pebble if they want to, and then that's added into the memory garden in the care home. It's not compulsory, but it's a way for people to connect and acknowledge a loss in a way that is hopefully quite safe and very individual. Most care settings have one-to-one catch-ups with key workers or something like that, and it may be that it's worth considering adding conversations about bereavement and loss to those catch-ups. not that everybody needs to talk about it, but opening up that door for people who do want to. And again, it may be that in things like residents' meetings or other forums where service users are engaged in what's happening in the service, to invite a conversation about bereavement and loss. And the other thing to note, of course, is that I have a tendency to refer to people who are caring in a hands-on capacity, but of course there's also a lot of other team members that are integral parts of a care environment who will be interacting with service users, who will be having relationships with them, who will be, maybe cooking food, bringing food, working in the garden, lots of different people who will be around, who again potentially are at even greater risk maybe of that relationship and that loss not being acknowledged and recognised. So it felt important to also make an important reference to that. And following on from the pebbles, a couple of ideas that people have shared is, so in one nursing home, they have a specific board where everybody who they have cared for who has died, either there is an order of service or something that reflects that person and acknowledges that they have been an important part of that community and are no longer physically there. And then the other image on the slide is a rose garden. And so that's a space where if families and other residents choose to, that's a space where for people who are no longer part of that community because they've died, there can be something there that represents them as in memory of them. Okay, so just to conclude, so we've got lots of time hopefully for people to share their thoughts. General principles of helping each other, particularly, well, personally, but also in a professional capacity and teams, is inviting the conversation and saying the name of the person who's died. So when somebody who has been cared for a long time has died, just inviting that conversation in a way that feels natural. Maybe that's in staff huddles, maybe that's in staff meetings, maybe that's in supervision, maybe that's just in passing as you're making a cup of tea together, but just inviting the conversation and acknowledging that this is an important conversation and an important relationship. Asking people specifically how they are today. This is a great piece of advice that somebody shared. The how are you is a really big question after you've experienced a bereavement. It's an enormous question. And I think this is very helpful. The question, how are you today, is actually a lot more answerable, because today actually it might be okay. And the next day actually it's really not okay. And actually being able to answer that more specific question, many people have is really good advice. Remember those activities that support general well-being and bring them up, create opportunities for them without creating pressure, but just when somebody has experienced a significant bereavement, a lot of that self-care, it just feels out of reach. So bringing that back into the space and creating those opportunities. Inviting connection. That connection might be to you, or it might be just remembering those different places that people find connection and helping somebody to figure out actually which connection might be really helpful for them, which ones maybe to avoid and which ones might be helpful for them. And the big piece of advice is just keep trying. This isn't a one-off thing. Your wonderful help and suggestions one day might just not be the day that it lands and that it works. And the next day, that very same suggestion for a walk or a coffee might actually be exactly what that person needs. Or a conversation about the person who's died, or the idea of thinking about a continued bond, or some suggestions about sleep hygiene. These things, one day they're just not the right day and it's not going to land, but that doesn't mean that it's not okay to keep trying and keep